musician, composer, producer, and he was one of the founders of the Rhapsody online music service. He's going to have a great talk for us today, so let's give him a great hand. Anu Kirk.
Can you guys hear me? Is my lavalier mic good? All right. First thing is I'm going to need some volunteers. I know you guys are all fired up to hear me talk about copyright law for the next hour and a half. You guys ready for that? I'm lying. I'm lying about that. But I do need 8 volunteers to participate. It's very simple. At certain points, you will see on the slides, it will say audience participation and then a number. And those of you that have the piece of paper with the number on it, you stand up, open it up, and yell it out loud. Okay? So I just need 8 people to do that. All right, so here's one. All right. I'll let Paul pass those out, and I will get started. So yes, my name is Anu. I live in San Francisco, and I work in the digital music business, and I've been working in the music business for a long time. I studied music at Dartmouth College, and then moved to Los Angeles with, of course, an economics degree to be a rock star, and as you can see, that's worked out very well for me. And I'm here today to talk with you guys about the music business and why it's so effed up right now and how we got there. In particular, I'm going to talk about the Rhapsody music service and selling music online and how you got from a music business that was pretty good when I was coming up to the state it is today. How many of you guys saw that report that just came out that said that it turns out that maybe the people who illegally download the most spend the most money on music? Did you guys see that? Yeah. And of course now all the record industry is arguing with themselves about, that's not what it means. I want to start with this gentleman, and I know nothing is more exciting than coming into a classroom for an hour-long talk and seeing some old dude projected up there. This is John Philip Sousa, and he was an absolute musical badass. He was also, in many ways, the epitome of what the music business was like before the 20th century. Okay? Because the music business that we think about is a product 100% of the 20th century. Sousa was born in like 1854. Okay? And in his day, the music business was, conducting symphonies, basically, and selling some sheet music. And Sousa was about as old school as you can get. He actually refused to conduct his symphony when they were being recorded because he was not into this whole recording thing. All right? And he's going to play a pivotal role, but it's good to see him because you can understand it. First of all, I understand you guys are pretty young. I'm pretty young too, but a little less young. But the music business, as we think of it, is a very new thing. Okay? Sousa's time was only 150 years ago, and I know for some of y'all, only 150 years is sort of a ridiculous phrase, but it's really not that long when you think about the entire span of human history, right? So, first point I want to make is that technology created the music business, or what we think of as today's music business. When you think about what John Philip Sousa considered new technology, it was a new tuba, right? The sousaphone. That was like a big innovation. Somebody invented a tuba that you wore around you with the bell pointing forward, and this was like high tech for the day. But what we think about as a music business is 100% the product of technology. Why? Because that's how you get from this music, right? It's vibrations in the air. It's a live performance. It's energy. It's emotion. It's feeling. It's how you transfer that into that, right? Because before the 20th century, you couldn't do that. Right? Music meant you had to go and see it played, or you had to make it be played. This is a very important point. Technology also changes the music business. This is one of the themes that I will be touching on repeatedly throughout our time together this evening. And I will hustle through this so that we have ample time for questions. I'll also let you guys know that I'm happy to stay late if y'all have questions, and I'm going to be around a little bit tomorrow, too. So, and I'll put my email address up. Technology, of course, also, move this down so I can stop popping my P's there. Technology also changes music, right? It doesn't just change the music business. And that's one thing I also want you to keep in mind is that it's music business. These are two things, and they're very different. Being a really good musician does not make you a good businessman. And being a good businessman does not make you a good musician. And sometimes being a good music businessman doesn't mean you know much about either one of those things. Technology also changes culture. Now, I have seen it with my own eyes, right? From when I was a college student, a laptop was about the size of one of those rollboard suitcases that you had, and nobody had them, right? Computers were, like the size of buildings, and they ran on coal and stuff like that. And now that everybody can carry around little tiny computers with them, it's changed everything. Some of you might even think about how different your lives are now that you have things like Facebook and Twitter from just a couple years ago when those things didn't exist. But most importantly, technology changes, and that means that all of these things I'm talking about keep moving along. So our story starts in 1473 with the first machine-printed sheet music. Not long after Gutenberg had started slapping type together, someone figured out that you could just start running off sheet music. And number one, who's number one?
Oh no! Sheet music duplication will destroy the music industry.
Exactly. Because at that time, the music industry meant things like, well, I have a guy who cranks out sheet music for me, or I have a bunch of people who sit there and scribble out sheet music for me. And the other thing is now there's this copying machine. All of a sudden, you can start running off copies of sheet music, and no one can stop you, right? You can run them off as fast as you can turn the crank on the side of that press or bring the big thing down. Well, I dare say that music lasted a little bit longer than this, but it was still a big deal. Several hundred years later, of course, you get the first copyright law in the United States. Okay, there's a little tiny bit of copyright law in here, but I promise it'll be fun. It's passed in Connecticut, and just a couple years later, it's adopted by Congress. And it's a huge amount of time. It's 14 whole years, plus if you want to, you can renew your copyright for another 14 years. And that's a big deal because at this time, people didn't live much past 35 or 40. 1831, they extend it, and they make the initial term twice as long, and most importantly, given how short people lived, widows and orphans can renew it in case you happen to die. And speaking of dying, in 1864, Stephen Foster dies. I'm hoping that some of you know who Stephen Foster is. Anyone? Anyone? All right. Oh, man, what are you teaching these people? Stephen Foster was basically the first professional songwriter for all intents and purposes. And he wrote songs that are so timeless and such classics in our culture that many people think they're like traditionals. They're folk songs, but they're not. This guy wrote them. And he, contrary to what people believe, he was actually a very shrewd businessman. He kept meticulous records of how much money he was supposedly owed from his publisher who duplicated his sheet music and sold it. And yet he dies in 1864 penniless, totally stone cold broke, with a very sad little piece of paper in his pocket. You guys can look it up on the internet what it actually said, but break your heart. But this guy dies, and one of the good things to come out of his death is people start saying, we really need to do something about copyright law, because one of the reasons this guy died broke is he only made money when his publisher duplicated the music and sold it. If other publishers duplicated the music and sold it, which they did, he got nothing. Nothing. So this starts some rumblings in the United States about modifying the way copyright law works. And then the bomb drops. 1878, Edison patents the phonograph. This is, granted, it's not quite the 20th century yet, but it's really the start of the 20th century. Because now, all of a sudden, you can take that ephemeral, transient stuff, the vibrations in the air that's music, and you can turn it into something you can reproduce at will. This is world-changing. Because now I'm not just reproducing the notes, I'm reproducing the sound. 1897, we get something called the pianola, or reproducing piano. Number 2. Yes, that's right. Now, this is where I think it really starts to get interesting. So you have the pianola. This is a player piano. It basically works with sticking a piece of paper. It's got a bunch of holes punched in it that correspond to where the keys are. Those of you that have worked with digital audio workstations may recognize that the really simple view that everybody uses with the keyboard up the side and the lines across is called piano roll notation. And it's called that for a reason, because it's modeled on this. The problem with this is that this isn't sheet music, and it isn't a sound recording. It's literally just a big scroll with a bunch of holes punched in where the notes are, right? And again, one of the advantages is it's very easy to duplicate this, right? But the other thing that's interesting is now you can take the piano you have at home and you can push a machine on top of it, because that's what the early pianolas were like, and it'll play the piano for you with one of these piano rolls. So you don't have to sit there and practice anymore. You can just hook up one of these and do it. But more interestingly, we are of the opinion that a perforated paper roll, such as that manufactured by the defendant, is not a copy of complainant's staff notation. And this means that according to the United States Circuit Court of Appeals discussing this copyright law case in 1908, if I write a piece of music, anybody out there can turn it into a piano roll and sell it for as much money as they want. I get nothing. Nothing. Right? That's bad news, especially since if I buy one of these piano roll deals, I'm probably not going to be buying the sheet music because the piano is going to play it for me. So this is a pretty serious issue because also these pianolas start taking over. Everybody wants one. Sort of the iPod of its day in more ways than one. And that's where our buddy John Philip Sousa comes in. Sousa writes an article for a magazine. It's called The Menace of Mechanical Music. And I encourage all of you to write that down, The Menace of Mechanical Music by John Philip Sousa. And after we're done here, read it. You can get it as a PDF off the internet. Just Google it up. Sousa makes two key points in this, one of which I will come back to at the end. But the second one is basically this article is kind of propaganda, right? He's basically saying, look, I'm John Philip Sousa, musical badass. I'm not making any money off these piano rolls, and that ain't right. So I want the law to get changed. And he's a very popular guy. He's written, tons of marches. He was in the military, leading bands and stuff, very well known, and his words carried a lot of weight. And part of what he does leads to some copyright law change in the United States, where finally piano rolls and other things are considered protected by copyright. They're all works of authorship, and they're covered. So that's good news. In 1918, lateral disc patents expire, and this is important because now what used to be cylinders are very hard things to duplicate. But as most of you, I would imagine, know, for vinyl records, you just get a metal thing and you start stamping these things out like cookie cutters. And since the patents had expired, anybody could start doing this stuff for very low cost. So the phonograph begins to take off. Everybody starts putting these in their homes. Again, very much like the iPods and so forth of their day. And it starts changing things significantly in all kinds of ways. 1920s, commercial radio broadcasts begin, and yes, it's not bad enough that you have piano rolls and staff music, but now you can buy this box that costs a fraction of a piano and turn it on, and people are broadcasting music, and it's hurting the music business for a couple reasons. One, it's not just a question of people playing records over there, because records still pretty much sound real bad, and the radio broadcasts sound real bad. But instead of people filing into an auditorium to see John Philip Sousa conducting, they can just turn this radio on and sit home in front of their big giant wooden radio and listen to the symphony there for free in exchange for listening to a soap commercial. Oh my God, right? This is going to be the end. But again, this is 1920s. I'm pretty sure we still had a music business a little bit after the 1920s. And in fact, things started to change quite a bit, and people started thinking about how they could actually make money off of this. Things are okay for a couple years, right? From the 20s to the 50s, the music business starts to mature. People are selling records. Tape gets introduced. Instead of having to stamp out discs, you can actually do stuff with tape, and it's all good. And we get kind of a mature business where people are buying vinyl records after moving up from 78s. They're going to record stores. They're listening to the radio. People are starting to make a little money on radio. ASCAP's been founded. BMI's been founded. People are starting to make money, and there is basically what we would think of as the modern music business, in effect, right? People are still going to shows. They're still buying music. And then this happens. Number 4. Yes. In the 1960s, FM stereo radio begins to broadcast, and this is a big change. Because prior to this, you had AM radio, which sounds pretty bad. And you just can't make it sound very good. It's the nature of the technology for doing analog AM transmission. But FM stereo radio sounds real good, and it's stereo, right? So you can basically put a vinyl record on and play it, and people at home can listen to it, and it's going to sound practically as good as listening on the stereos of that day. And people really start to get upset about this. Because again, they're concerned that there are people who are sitting here playing free music all day long over the airwaves. This is going to be really bad for the music business, right? Right? I mean, clearly radio must be stopped. It would be the worst thing in the world to have your music played on the radio. And in 1963, as if that's not bad enough, Philips introduces the compact cassette. 1976, we have yet another copyright extension, and this one is significant for a couple reasons. One is, look how long it is now. And then you have this works for hire thing, and then you have this extended copyrights for existing works, which hasn't been done before. And it enumerates this fair use thing, but pay no mind to that. And in 1979, this innovative company, one of the best electronics companies in the world, comes out with a handheld device that comes with headphones that you can listen to your music on and walk around with. It's not the iPod. It's the Sony Walkman. And when you put that together with the high-quality music being broadcast over FM, and the fact that now, for the first time, you can make cheap, affordable copies in the privacy of your own home using the cassette, and then walk around listening to them on this, number 5? Yes. So one of the things that's really interesting here is that, granted, there were reel-to-reel machines before, but they were very expensive, very cumbersome to use, really only for audiophiles. But with the cassette and all these things coming together, people are really starting to worry, because now you have a reason why you might want to buy cassettes. A reel-to-reel machine is even small ones are real big and real heavy. But this, you can put this in your pocket, right? You can go and tape stuff off the radio. Radio stations, FM radio stations, like, coming right up, we're going to play the entire Beatles' White Album with no commercials. So and they would literally say, so get your cassette decks ready. So the record industry is finally sort of getting sick of just sort of waving its hands and running around and panicking. So they decide to do something a little bit different. And they start a campaign basically going after their audience and saying, what you're doing is wrong. Stop. You're hurting artists, you're hurting us. And this logo was actually stuck on the packaging or inner sleeve of almost every record sold for some time. Artists were sort of mixed about it, but they were serious about this. Home taping is killing music, right? Now, by this time, we're quite a few of these panic attacks into things. But as I said, this one's a little bit different because people can start to make their own copies at home for the first time. And it gets pretty easy to distribute them. And you can make a copy of the cassette, too. You don't have to keep going back to the source. You don't have to have the master. So what happens is, effectively, these guys are freaking out about losing control over the sound recording duplication, right? Up until now, if you wanted to make a copy of a sound recording, you needed very expensive, specialized equipment. Duplicating it and distributing it was a real challenge. But now, with this, not only do you have the ability to record what you want, your own stuff, fairly easily in a reasonably high-def format and pass it out, but you can make copies of their stuff. 1982, the compact disc. And make no mistake, my friends, this is the greatest of all the audio formats. I know, some of y'all are thinking, oh, you're crazy, man, it's vinyl. No, this is the best. And I would let you know right now, this is the golden age of the compact disc, and I encourage all of you to rush out to your local record store and buy as many as you can. Because in just a few years, you guys will all be sitting around going, man, remember the good old days in 2009 when you could buy music and hold it in your hand, and it sounded real good, and it came with that little tiny booklet and that awful plastic box that you couldn't open? Because these are going to go away real soon. The most important thing to note about this, as I'm sure you guys are keenly aware because you're smart bunches, it's digital. Right? And the main advantage to when you turn something into numbers is that it's very easy to make perfect copies. In fact, that's really the only kind of copy you can make, and all the technology that's wrapped up in this is aimed at making sure that every copy is just like the original. And just a few years later, the recordable CD comes along. Some interesting, clever guy figures out a way to actually let people burn their own CDs with a laser, and number 6, yes. And they were so afraid of this stuff that they tried to pass a law, and did pass a law, called the 1992 Audio Home Recording Act, which I'm sure you'll be very happy I won't go into an elaborate discussion of right now. But this is all moving along. So now we have the ability for you to record your own CDs. And yes, here's a bunch of German nerds. These are the guys from the Fraunhofer Institute. They're very important because these are the guys who created the MP3 codec. And they did it in 1991, right? And their idea was, well, we can take this data and we can squish it down. And this was important because even in 1991, the internet and computer networks were starting to enter the mainstream. They were not just the product of or purview of the defense industry or uber nerds, right? I was in college around that time, and we actually had email and computer jacks in the rooms, and at the same time, they're very low data transfer speeds. And this let you take a big giant wave file or sound recording and smush it down to something that theoretically you could transfer. And as I'm sure those of you who have done the engineering stuff know, the other ways of shrinking down data size, like squishing it to mono or chopping the bit rate from 16 bits down to 4 bits or chopping the sampling rate down to like 8K, that doesn't sound very good. And this sounded very good. These are all pieces of this puzzle that are starting to come together. In 1998, Sonny Bono died. He skied into a tree. He was part of the Sonny and Cher duo. It's true. I'm not making any of this up. And he was a senator. And one of the things that he had really been pushing for was yet another amendment to copyright law. So it's now really, really long. Anything that was copyrighted before 1978 was extended for 20 more years. And Disney was the biggest lobbyist. And I'm assuming that some of you guys are really smart about this stuff. But again, it's worth noting that we've gone in the space of not very much time from 14 years plus 14 years to that. And I'd also note that because copyright has continued to be extended in this way, it means that basically nothing after 1923 has fallen into the public domain. Nothing. And currently, nothing will until 2018. And that's assuming that Disney doesn't take its wheelbarrows full of cash and start buying congressmen and senators again and urging yet another extension to protect Mickey Mouse. Again, I'm not just boring you guys with facts. It's all coming together for a reason. I got a master plan. Also in 1998, they passed this horrible thing, the DMCA. Among other things, it has very specific rules for what you can do with this exciting new thing that people are starting to do of broadcasting or streaming MP3 music over the internet and calling it internet radio. Right? It has specific rules, and it says you can do this provided you follow this certain set of rules and pay this certain amount of money. And in 1998, the first commercial MP3 players are launched. You have the Eiger MP3 Man and the Rio PMP300. And those of you who are into visual design may notice that there's something oddly familiar about this LCD display over a circular control with buttons. Number 7. Yes. Note the key difference. Let's sue. Now, one of the things that's worth noting is that the RIAA, the Recording Industry Association of America, was originally formed as a standards body, right? Because one of the things that had happened in radio is that initially you had to buy one company's radio to hear their radio stations, and if you wanted to hear the other radio stations from another company, you had to buy a different radio. Ugh. And one of the things that had happened with records was trying to standardize the speeds that they played back out, or the equalization curves. The RIAA had done those things. And when the CD had launched, a bunch of technology companies, before they had launched the format, had gone around and talked to a bunch of record labels about, well, tell us how we should make this format so that it will be good for you. And that was part of the development for the CD. But Diamond was a little tiny scrappy company in Silicon Valley, California that was mostly known for making video cards for computers. And they had a guy who came by their shop one day and showed that there was this company that had taken that MP3 codec and put it on a chip and showed them a reference design for how you could make a hardware MP3 player that you could load up. I had one of these. It cost $300 in 1998 dollars, and it had 32 megabytes of memory. It also had a slot for a card, so that if you wanted to, you could spend another $100 for a 16 megabyte card and put it in there. And it wouldn't see it as one big chunk of memory. It meant you could load up like 5 songs in the 16 megs and another like 6, 7 songs in the... And it didn't come with ripping software either. But what did the record business do? They sued. And they said, this is in violation of a number of laws we have in place. These guys are duplicating music. And the record industry lost. They lost hard. These were ruled computer peripherals because you had to connect them up to a computer to transfer the data over. And in 1999, the end of the 20th century is also arguably the end of the world for our beloved music business because this happens. Napster 1.0, number 8. Yes. Note again, the evolution of the record company's thinking. Now they're not just going to sue Napster, which was launched by a college student about your age, but they're also going to sue the people who are using it. This is akin to saying, not only are we going to say don't tape at home, but we're going to come find you and we're going to drag you off to jail if you do it. Now, Napster 1.0 was really, really cool. And it was also really, really wrong for a bunch of reasons. But now all of the pieces are in place. This is sort of where I come in. In 1999, I had spent about the last 9 years in LA playing in bands, working in recording studios, writing and recording music, and working a day job doing product management for a company that made products for professional recording studios. In 1997, I was getting into music on the internet, and back in those days, it was a type of file called a mod file, which was basically like a MIDI file with some samples stuck on the end, and you used these special players to play it back, and you could get a whole electronica song in about 100K. And there were little labels, net labels, that were passing these mod files around, and there was this big controversy because all of a sudden people stopped pushing the mod files, which were easy to crack open and remix because it was just MIDI plus the samples and instructions for playing them, and switching over to these MP3s, which were straight up audio. And I remember the next thing, of course, that people figured out is that you could kludge together some kind of command line CD ripper and get one of these Fraunhofer codecs out of the right piece of software, and you could actually copy your CDs, crush them down, and put them up on your FTP site, and people could download them. I was working at my day job, and it was a job that was pretty boring, and I remember downloading my first MP3. It was a track by Ronnie Size. It was at 96 kbps. I still have it on my hard drive. And I downloaded this track over a 28.8 dial-up modem. It took about 10 minutes, but I remember when I hit play, it blew my mind. It blew my mind. And I immediately started having ideas about what you could do with this. I mean, this was just a file sitting up on a hard drive somewhere, right? What if I took every CD in the world and I put it up on a hard drive somewhere, or clips from it? So instead of reading Rolling Stone, because believe it or not, people actually read Rolling Stone back then, and looking at the reviews and going, oh, this reviewer makes this record sound good. I think I'll go buy it and listen to it. And then finding out it was awful, I could actually listen to clips from it and understand what, negative space meant. I think it means silence. But I started thinking about this, and I had some engineer friends who were looking to do something, because also around this time there were a bunch of these startup companies going in California. And I helped a business friend of mine get together with some engineer friends of mine, and they were going to do an advertising-powered internet radio product that learned what you liked and got better the more you listened to it. You could rate stuff thumbs up and thumbs down. It's very similar to what Pandora is doing today, which I'm sure many of you have heard of Pandora. The problem was when we launched it, about 6 months after we launched it, the internet advertising market collapsed. Totally, everything ran out of money. It was not quite as bad as things are today, but it was pretty bad. And I had just moved to San Francisco, and it was, those of you who ever get into startups, you will find that there comes a time when the money starts getting tight, and you start having these very grim meetings where you're packing all of the people that work for the company into this tiny little office, and everybody's kind of anxious, and the engineer who is also serving as the bookkeeper is kind of squinting at an Excel spreadsheet. Someone goes, so can we pay the bills this month? One of the other engineers and I were driving home, and my job was basically to design this internet radio product. We're driving home. We were supposed to be going to some trade show at Moscone Center to talk about internet audio, but we were depressed because we knew that we were going to run out of money in 2 weeks, and we're going to have to lay off our 35 friends. And instead of going to this trade show, we went back to his place and had a couple beers at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're basically sitting there going, man, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And we hit on this idea of what if we took our streaming technology and our music library, and instead of presenting it in a DMCA-compliant internet radio format, we presented it in a new type of service that looked and felt like Napster, but was going to be 100% legal, because instead of giving you copies of the music, we were just going to stream it at you. Okay, so you wouldn't get to keep it, but who cares? Who wants files on your hard drive? I mean, the whole reason I buy a CD is not so I can have that lovely shiny disc, it's so I can put it in my machine and press play and the music comes out. And if I can press play and have the music come out wherever I can get internet, that's got to be worth something, right? More importantly, we could probably find someone who'd be willing to give us some money to develop that idea. So about a week later, we had a prototype together, which we were calling Snapster, for Super Napster. We quickly decided that that was probably not a good name to kick the product around, so we started calling it Aladdin, because it was going to tame the digital music genie that had been let out of the bottle. That was the phrase that everybody was using. And it's also worth noting at that time that Napster was getting sued by like everybody and their brother. And Napster went to the record companies and they said, tell you guys what, we will give you $1 billion. $1 billion cash. You know, in one of those like Miami Vice drug dealer briefcases right on the table. And all we want to do is be able to sell these songs for $1 each to people that want them. This was like in 1999 or 2000, and the record industry basically said, no way. No way. You take your $1 billion and you get out of here, we think we can shut you down, and there's no way that we're going to let people sell MP3s for $1. It turns out, when you're making stuff like this, these internet music services, and in addition to Rhapsody, I also built most of Walmart's digital music services and have working on yet another project right now. So I've got a long set of experiences between the internet and radio. It turns out that the software is actually pretty easy. You can find almost anybody to code up whatever you want to do. Okay? But that doesn't mean anything because the music is essential. The music is very much like what's going on in this picture. You got this beautiful, fantastic, expensive jet airplane, and it's totally freaking useless without the jet fuel. And those of you who have to fly a lot may notice that the prices of your ticket tends to fluctuate. And the thing that causes that ticket price to fluctuate is the cost of the jet fuel. That is the single biggest cost involved in air travel. And it means that air travel is only going to start getting more and more expensive. Without jet fuel, you got nothing. Now, I mentioned that we were going to do streaming instead of downloading. Here's where it gets really exciting. I can just see your faces like dripping with excitement looking at this wonderful diagram. Look, the world is divided into two things as far as music goes. You got performances and phonorecords, okay? Performance is pretty straightforward. You're in a club or you're playing something out of a jukebox. You're just standing there listening as the music passes you by. You buy a ticket, you put $0.25 in the jukebox, or $1 or whatever they charge these days. Versus a phonorecord, which means you get a copy and you have a copy of it, right? Now, the interesting thing about phonorecords is it's not just like sheet music. It also means that you have a composition and a sound recording, and you have a whole complicated way that you have to negotiate things. But thanks to John Philip Sousa and the copyright laws, the compositions are easy. You got a mechanical royalty, so you have a compulsory license at a statutory rate, right? But for sound recordings, you have to go to the labels. This is why you can cover somebody else's song, but if you make a copy of the label sound recording, you're going to jail. So we didn't want to mess with this because it was very clear that the labels weren't interested in this. So we started doing this instead. We figured streaming is a performance, right? It's just like a jukebox. And our whole idea was, well, you'll pay us just like having a jukebox on your computer that's got all the music in the world in there. Only instead of charging you every time you want to play it, just pay us a flat fee, $10 a month. Play as much as you want off your computer. That's all. And because I had spent some time in the music business, I understood that we had to go get rights for the compositions, and we were going to pay the performing rights societies who have reasonable rates for these sorts of things. And unfortunately, we were going to have to go talk to the record labels and get permission for this, because this wasn't terrestrial radio. This was streaming over the internet. So we had to go and close deals with all 4 major labels at that time, and it was really tough work. They didn't like the idea. They charged us outrageous amounts of money. And then, of course, after they have these meetings where they're like, well, tell us exactly how you're going to do everything. It turned out that they were building their own music services, very much like ours, with larger teams and more money. We beat them to market, and none of their services survived. In 2001, we launched Rhapsody 1.0. And one of the big deals about this was that we had all 4 major labels on board. The catalog was very small. I think it even says somewhere on here that it's like got a whopping 20,000 songs. But that was a huge deal. And it was a huge deal for a couple of reasons. You cannot imagine the obstacles that are involved. The record industry likes to picture themselves as being in the intellectual property business. But when we went to the Harry Fox Agency, which is the enforcement and rights arm of the NMPA, the National Music Publishers Association, they said, okay, well, it's simple. You guys just have to fill out a form for the stuff that you want, and we'll process it and get you a license and tell you where to, basically send your check for the streaming so we could pay the publishers, right? So we do this, and we get a phone call after we sent in all this stuff, because we sent in a lot of requests. And they said, yeah, listen, about those requests you sent in, it's going to take us about 10 years to get through all those. We're still on note cards here for database. So they said, tell you what we're going to do instead. We'll just agree to figure out how much you're going to pay us in the future. Set aside a little bit of money now. We'll kind of argue about it later so you can get the business off the ground. And that was all good. We started off with 20 tracks. Today, Rhapsody has over 8 million, both majors and independent labels. It has basically all of the music that's legally available. But of course, everything isn't legally available. Rhapsody was launched. It did pretty good. Initially, we got lots of attention because we were this scrappy little startup company that had done pretty well. And we were feeling really good about ourselves. And then a week later, Apple put out this thing, number 9. Number 9, did I not give out number 9? Well, oh no, people copying music for their iPods is going to destroy the music business. And it got so bad that Mike Eisner, who was head of the Disney Corporation, one of the biggest brands for content creation, went in front of Congress and said, Steve Jobs and Apple and this thing are encouraging consumers to pirate music. Said that on the record in front of Congress. So iTunes very quickly ran around to the labels, sent Steve Jobs in there with his reality distortion field, and he said, look, we're just a tiny little company. We don't have very many users. Why don't you just do an experiment with us and let us sell songs for $1 to play on this thing? We just started selling it. Nobody's got them. What's the worst thing that could happen? And he said, I'm Steve Jobs, man. That computer sitting on your desk, dude, I made that. It's true. He really did. And they all fell for it. They all fell for it. So you end up in this world where you have sort of two business models. On the one hand, you have downloads, which are phono records. Very clearly, you're getting a copy of the song, right? So you get specific items, you purchase them individually, you have limited ownership because you know all that text you click through and you're just going accept, give it to me? That all basically says you don't own the downloads you think you own. And you can't do with them what you can do with a CD. And there's a bunch of people that are in this space, iTunes, Walmart, Amazon. There's a ton of people selling downloads now. And I would note that none of the record stores that used to be around even a couple of years ago are around anymore. They're all gone. But these guys exist. And you have on the other side subscriptions where you get all the music you want, monthly fee. You don't own it, but so what? And this is like Rhapsody, Napster, and Zune, which is Microsoft's entry, has something similar. And it's supposed to be like analogous to the previous chart I had where you had performances and phono records. Of course, once we launched this, the phono record people came and said, well, you're making copies. You're not performing, you're making copies because when I pass the bits from this computer to this computer over here, there's usually a server in the middle, and since all those bits pass through there, you got to pay me for that copy. And that's a rather contentious subject that I've had to testify in front of federal copyright judges about and is still sort of up in the air. But these two models exist and they're mature now. And the iPod is pretty clearly one. I'm assuming that pretty much all y'all have iPods. Who doesn't have an iPod? Okay. Yeah, you going to get another one? Yeah. Everybody has one. Everybody loves it. And, to tell you the truth, it's a fine piece of hardware. But what's happened is that from 2001, when Apple was not even in the music business until now, something shocking has happened, and that's that Apple is the music business right now. Okay? In 2005, for the first time, they were the #1 retailer for a new release. It was Coldplay's X and Y album that came out. Okay? And that was a big deal. The company I was working at the time was responsible for rack jobbing all of the CDs and DVDs and books in Walmarts around the country. And they were flabbergasted. How can Apple, this computer company that doesn't even have any distribution centers, actually be selling more than Best Buy or Walmart? But they did. And just 4 years later, in 2009, Apple is the #1 music retailer. Not digital music retailer, music retailer. They sell more music than Best Buy does. They sell more music than Walmart does. And they have everybody locked in because the file type that Apple sells really only plays on the iPod. And at this point, the record industry is not real happy with them because they have, instead of a couple of stores or retail partners they can play off of, they only have this one. So that is about where we are today. This is all leading up to talking about 2009. And I'm starting to run out of time, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit here. Today's music business is hurting. It's hurting real bad. It has seen declines of 5 to 20% year over year since 2000. That is not good. Sales are dropping. Overall cash value of the industry is dropping. Digital sales are starting to increase fairly dramatically, but the dollar volume they represent is nothing compared to the revenue that's been lost from CD sales. Additionally, the black market or pirate market or file sharing, whatever you want to call it, is something like 10 times, 100 times the size of the legitimate music market. It's crazy. Right? You just can't stop it. There was nothing to replace the CD. On January 2009, for example, it was the beginning of this year, Nielsen released some music business statistics for 2008. Total sales were down by 8.5%. Physical unit sales had dropped by 20%. It's worth pointing out that most people just don't care about music that much. Right? So the casual fans weren't buying, and all the really hardcore fans were happily downloading free things from Napster or file sharing amongst themselves. So we've heard all this talk about, oh no, things are going to destroy the music business. So my question is, well, what's destroying the music business? I mean, with my friends, built Rhapsody because I love music, and I didn't want the music business to die. I think artists deserve to get paid for their work, but I also think there have to be different ways of getting the music out to people that don't involve selling them a digital file for $1 and expecting them to treat it like a physical thing. I have a friend I used to work with who says iTunes is yesterday disguised as tomorrow. So what's really destroying the music business? Well, the very things, ironically, that created it. You have the computer. This is a nice vintage computer. An ADAT machine. I don't know if any of you guys know what this is. And of course you have piracy. And I should put little quotes around this. But the thing I'd point out is that the music business has changed very dramatically in two key ways. Okay? Remember that up until very recently, if you wanted to make and record music, you had to have these big fancy pieces of equipment like lathes and disc presses and lots of trucks to put your music on. And you had to go into a recording studio. And as far back as 40 years ago, they didn't have 24-track machines. They were building their own that had like 4 tracks and 8 tracks and having to build their own consoles. And there weren't a lot of recording studios. But now, with a computer like that, or even cheaper than that, you can make your own records. And I'm sure most of you already have made your own recordings. Not only that, but you don't have to do what I did in the 90s and spend $5,000 to get 1,000 CDs pressed up and then drive around to every record store in LA trying to get them to take a couple on consignment. And then follow up a month later so I could go and collect the $5 I had made from the 3 CDs that they had sold. Right? You can put your music up on the internet. You can sell it in Germany or New Jersey or Japan or wherever people want to buy it. That's huge. It's a huge deal, but it means that these same tools are what's clobbering the music business. And of course, demand for music's gone through the roof. It used to be that kids had a couple records, and now they have iPods full of them. The number of paid-for tracks on iPods remains the same. It's about 20, right? But iPods, last time I checked, held more than about 20 songs. People are also spending their money on things like the Xbox and games for that. And another big problem is distribution. As I mentioned, in the 90s, when I wanted to get my CD into stores, I had to drive around to LA, and there were at least 3 giant independent record stores, or big record stores. There was Tower, there was the Virgin Megastore, and there was a place called Aaron's, which was the big indie shop right on Highland. And they're all gone now. Sam Goody's gone. Every chain is gone. Right? All that's left are places like Amoeba, and they make all their money from selling used CDs. Because that's like a money machine for them. People are dumping their CDs for pennies on the dollar, and they turn around and put them right back in the rack for like $5. And the places that most people can buy CDs now are Walmart. And turns out Walmart and most other retail businesses have this equation that they call like revenue per square inch. Okay, and what that means is they got this big giant store like that, right? So they think about how much revenue is each square inch of space generating. All right, so a TV takes up a certain amount of square inches, but they make a lot of money on it. And even if they put CDs in one of those little tiny tall racks that spins around, they don't make enough money off the sales to justify the square footage or the square inches that that rack takes up. So they're talking about taking all the music out of Walmarts now. And what's happened is since all the people who really like to buy music casually could go to Walmart and buy it for nothing instead of going down to their record store, all the foot traffic to those record stores stopped, and many of the local record stores have died. So pretty soon, for large places in the country, the only way there's going to be left to buy music is going to Amazon or iTunes. It is a great, great time to be a musician, however, despite the fact that the business is hurting. The tools that you guys have today are incredibly powerful. The ability to network, to promote yourself. There are things that you can do today in the studio or marketing-wise that you could not do for any price 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago. In 1998, about 30,000 albums were released. In 2008, over 100,000 albums were released. One of the downsides to this is a very basic economic principle of sort of supply and demand, or supply and cost. There's a lot more music out there, and when there's a whole lot of something, what happens to the price? It goes down. And also, to make yourself stand out, not just from the 100,000 albums that came out last year, but all of the thousands and thousands of albums that have come out over the last 100 years, you got to be pretty good. You got to have some kind of gimmick or something to stand out from that. So it gets really tough. There's a lot of people making music, and that's really good and really bad. So now that you can do that, I want to come back to our buddy Sousa and talk about his second point. This is something that, and I'm just about done here, so this is something that's really worth noting. So Sousa's second point in his article, remember his first point was about copyright law and trying to protect musicians so they could make a living. But his second point is the one that I want you all to think about. Sousa, at this time when he was alive, every home had a room in it called a parlor. And this parlor was filled with musical instruments. And music was something you did with your friends and family all the time. You still went out to see shows, but music was something everybody did. And in Sousa's article, he talks about how these new music machines, this mechanical music, the pianola, and the Edison cylinder, or the record, is going to destroy the culture of the amateur musician and leave us with a population that was a bunch of passive listeners sitting there and listening to professional executants. And the creepy thing is, it's pretty much right. Okay, people, you guys are special, because most of you are here, you are musicians, you've learned how to play a bunch of instruments, you think about music, but most people don't. And when I talk to people, they say things like, I could never learn how to play an instrument, it's too hard, I don't know how to be creative. And that whole social component of just getting together with your friends and playing music has really been exchanged for this idea of being on a stage with a bunch of people listening to you. I don't know whether that's good or bad, but what it leads me to think about is that there's still a desire for people to make music in a communal experience, and I think that's part of why Rock Band and Guitar Hero and even karaoke are popular, because they get a little of that back somehow. But technology created the music business, right? It enabled it, because now you had this way to capture sound, right? But maybe it's also sort of fitting that for this last 100 years, maybe that 100 years or that 50 years, maybe that's the anomaly, that's the unusual part. And the music business is sliding back down to where it should be or where it has been for thousands and thousands of years. I don't know, but maybe that's the case. Music will absolutely survive. Group music is an essential part of major social events, weddings, funerals, anything you can think of. And maybe instead of agonizing over the shrinking music business, we should focus on the opportunity to take music out of the headphones and speakers, off the stages, and back into our homes and communities. Spend less time worrying about the few currently making music and how much money they're making, and spend more time worrying about the many people who aren't making music. So I just have one more thing to tell you guys, and it's also very serious, and that's wear your earplugs. Currently,